Good afternoon, everybody. Are we all set? It has just gone 4, so warm welcome from ERF management, colleagues, network to a very special panel this afternoon to launch and discuss a recent publication, a very timely one, on retooling development aid in the 21st century, the importance of budget support. We have a very distinguished panel of 3 of the authors who will be taking us through the book, and also very distinguished lead commentators to give some reflections and initial reactions. I'm proudly joined by Dr. Shahrokh Fardoust. Dr. Shahrokh is a research professor at the Global Research Institute and visiting scholar in economics at the College of William and Mary, and he'll be presenting the book and its coverage, as well as the evolving global capital flows and aid architecture. He'll then be followed by a key co-author, Dr. Moritz, Piatti. You'll have to forgive me for not being able to pronounce the full name. So Dr. Moritz is a senior economist at the World Bank working at the nexus of public finance and health. And Dr. Moritz will be presenting the findings concerning the evolving role and types of policy-based lending, budget support across the MDBs and major bilaterals. And then we also have with us Dr. Stefan Koeberle, who's the Director, Strategy and Operations, Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank, and he will be able to tell us more about the findings on the performance of the budget support, the lessons learned in the last 2 decades, and the potentially vital role this lending instrument can play in helping developing countries address the development challenges they face in this century. And then I'll be introducing proudly Dr. Marika War, former Minister of Planning in Jordan, and Dr. Rabah Ariski, Research Director at the French National Center for Scientific Research, and former Chief Economist at both the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Shahrokh to start the session. Dr. Shahrokh, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shireen, for the very kind introduction and for allowing us to share our findings with the members of the ERF community, the researchers and policymakers in the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere who are members of this very important think tank for the region. I would just like to take a few minutes to introduce the idea of the book. The 5 authors have been colleagues at the World Bank in different times, in the research department, in the evaluation department, in operations. Interestingly, all of us have had operational experience with budget support as a part of our career. And we came together about 2016, 2007, early 2017, in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 crisis, financial crisis, where the budget support or policy-based lending was used very intensely by all multilateral development banks and some of the bilaterals in order to assist developing countries to deal with the crisis they were facing. And that involved quite a bit of innovation based on the lessons learned. But the instrument has been controversial basically in both developing country and in the donor countries, as well as within the institutions that use the instrument, because it was initially basically used in a very intensive way in the early 1980s in the aftermath of the second oil shock, It was a way to recycle petrodollars to developing countries that had developed very large balance of payment problem. And in that way, it was also conditioned very heavily on some policies that were not fully owned by countries that were implementing these policies or required to implement these policies. These were called the adjustment loans of the 1980s, structural adjustment loans, which became a kind of a very, very controversial instrument. By 2005, there was a consensus that was developed around a meeting in Paris. The Paris Agreement agreed on a number of, maybe we can go to the next slide where we discuss the next one. The next one, yeah. One more, because I'm trying to, okay, so trying to condense a lot of material in a few minutes. What was emphasized in the Paris Accord was that greater country ownership is needed on the reforms that will be implemented with the support of budget support, greater accountability for results, improved harmonization among donors on the policies that are going to be implemented, greater coordination again among the donors as well as the policymakers in developing countries that are receiving the budget support, and then using the results to leverage greater funding, by other donors as well as private funding, and much greater focus on building institutions and capacity within countries so that they can handle properly both in terms of their spending the proceeds as well as monitoring the results, and making sure that they can be mid-course corrections could be made where things are not going the right way. Also much greater emphasis on fiscal management and public spending, and also much greater predictability of resource flows, because under the old type of the instrument, the structural adjustment loans, they were given a number of tranches, and each tranche was conditioned very heavily on some policy changes. Some of those policy changes, because of their political economy or capacity on the recipient side, were delayed, and that delayed the tranche release, which also caused havoc in the development and the budgetary planning of the government that was receiving the aid. Okay, because the next slide. So that brings us to where does the question of where does budget support, or also called in the World Bank called development policy lending, in other MDBs also called policy-based lending, but basically the budget support in various forms, and my colleague Moritz will explain the different forms of budget support. But in the global context, we can go one more slide, Moritz. Okay. As you can see from this slide, and we are looking at a chart where financial flows to developing countries other than China is plotted from 1990 to 2022. And you can see that the ODA, the blue line, which is the official development assistance, which is by bilaterals and multilateral institutions on a concessionary basis and non-concessionary basis, but it's by these official institutions, is about $200 billion a year on a net basis. And until very recently, it was dwarfed by the private flows. As you can see, the portfolio and debt equity flows, which is the bank lending as well as the portfolio investment, the green line, and the FDI, the orange broken line were very dominant, and remittances, which was basically personal flows from workers who work mainly in the advanced economies and send money home, were dominant. One thing that we can see is that while ODA has been fairly stable and rising, FDI and portfolio investments have been very much pro-cyclical, that whenever there has been a shock to the world economy, from global financial crisis to COVID shock, and more recently the food and fuel crisis, which resulted as because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have been actually were cause of these flows going down exactly at the time that they are most needed, where the developing countries were developing balance of payments need for such funds. But the official flows and the multilateral development banks lending in terms of budget support, although they are much smaller than the private flows, but they are counter-cyclical, which is extremely important. So they are there when they are most needed. And more importantly, they do support policy reform. So I think put together, my sense is that from all the analysis that we have done in the book, one can say that ODA has played a very important role and continues to play a very important role. But in view of multiple crises that the world economy is facing, and in view of emerging needs for financial assistance to deal with climate change, pandemics, other financial crises, there is a need for a substantial increase in official lending going forward. The recent G20 meeting in India, in Delhi, their declaration clearly indicates that there is a need for substantial increase in lending by multilateral development banks, especially, and the World Bank has been working under the new leadership in order to find ways to basically more in a more optimal fashion use the resources that it has to both increase its lending capacity and also to leverage private flows. In leveraging private flows, I think the result of the efforts that have been made since 2015 indicates that it's a promising way to raise funds for developing countries, especially through various de-risking instruments. But the latest data that we have indicates that under the efforts that have been made by multilateral and bilateral institutions, the amounts that have been mobilized, we are talking about maybe $55–60 billion a year, which is basically is much higher than it was before, but significantly below the hopes of the so-called going from billions to trillions. So at best, maybe one-to-one mobilization of private finance can result from these de-risking efforts by the multilateral development banks. But so if they increase their lending capacity and they also use de-risking facilities they have at their disposal in a more effective way, it is possible that there will be a substantially higher amount of resources available for developing countries going forward. But this needs to be put in the context that one of the best instruments for basically scaling up financing is budget support, is much more efficient and it's more effective. And most importantly, it generally supports policy reform and institutional building going forward, which means that it prepares the grounds for a much higher private investment by improving the business climate, as well as building up and improving the capacity of countries to receive funds and spend them more effectively. I think I'm done, Moritz. Maybe you can go over the evolution of the budget support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shahrokh, and thanks so much to the organizer for inviting us here to speak today on the evolution of budget support. Building on what Shahrokh has said, what is it? What trends do we see, and what patterns do we see in terms of the deployment of the instrument? And we will show here that the use of the instrument has ebbed and flowed over the years. And while it is not the primary vehicle to deliver aid, it certainly is a very important one, and one that complements other forms of aid. So here we show two charts. On the left-hand side, we show how a budget support has evolved as a share of total ODA, and specifically, what the first message that you can take away from this chart is that budget support has constituted around 10 to 13% of overall ODA, but this has spiked during times of crisis. Right, so you see that during the global financial crisis and during the COVID crisis, where budget support has made up 20 to 25% of overall ODA. And then if we turn to the right-hand chart, we look at what has been the composition and who are the agencies that are providing budget support, and it stands out quite clearly that it is the multilateral development banks that provide the largest share of financing for budget support. So what we see here is that they cover about 85% of total budget support commitments, and here of those MDBs, the World Bank specifically through IBRD financing is the largest contributing agency. There are some DAC countries that have provided budget support, especially in the mid and late 2000s, but that has become less systematic over time. Now, in terms of the recipients, who are the countries that are receiving budget support, it's been often associated with low-income countries, but what we do see when we look closely is that significant financing volumes have been extended to middle-income countries, specifically as a result of one-off balance of payment support. Right? And as Shahrokh mentioned, that much of these variations in financing volumes reflect some of the counter-cyclical financing modalities, right, during times of needs, and that has been especially for IBRD financing from the World Bank. For low-income countries, we see that the programmatic engagement has been much more prevalent than for middle-income countries, and that has allowed for extending a sequenced reform program over the years to complement investment lending, right? And we see much less of that in middle-income countries. Now, one of the many benefits of budget support is that it is an instrument of flexibility, right? And the modalities of budget support have changed and grown over time to allow to cater for specific needs and country contexts, right? So budget support can be extended during as a once-off payments during times of crisis, for example. It can be used to crowd in private financing through de-risking, what Shahrokh has mentioned, or it can be used to help insure against natural disasters or emergencies. And as I mentioned earlier, there is the programmatic engagement support that will help with a sequenced reform agenda over time. What do we see in terms of the type of recipient countries that have been receiving budget support? And here we would like to point out that the quality of institutions, and specifically public financial management of recipient countries, has been considered the sine qua non, right, for to be allowed to receive budget support, right? Especially after Paris. But what we're seeing here is that the CPIA score of the World Bank that measures the quality of country institutions has declined. Right? And what that means is not necessarily that budget support is less effective, but rather that countries that the agencies extending budget support have been increasingly willing to give budget support to countries with lower CPIA scores, right? And specifically countries in fragile and conflict affected contexts, right? And this is been very much welcome, as it provides much needed liquidity and help advance political policy and institutional reforms. And today, about 1/4 of World Bank budget support lending is to FCV countries. What we see when we look at the right-hand side is that once we do engage in budget support, even if one looks at a lower starting point, at the lower baseline of the CPIA, that the engagement matters for improvements in the CPIA, and Stefan will go into this in more detail later. But the longer the sequential years of budget support, the longer the engagement, the greater the change in CPIA improvement, right? So budget support, even though we engage in countries with lower CPIA scores, matters for the overall engagement and the quality of institutions. Now, what type of conditionality has been supported over time? We see that, first of all, it's important to mention that the conditionality has changed, right? and the number of conditions have shifted significantly over time, and donors have become a lot more parsimonious, right? So we see much fewer conditions today than we used to 20 years ago in any given budget support operation. And there's also been a shift in the type of conditionality. Right? So when one looks at public administration, the share of public administration has declined significantly, the public administration type of reforms. So while they used to make up 56% in the late 2000s, this has gone down to around 40% today. And even within that, there's been a shift away from public expenditure management and civil service type reforms towards domestic revenue administration and tax policy and debt management, but which have picked up significantly, especially after 2015. Then there's been an engagement in the sectors. So if we look at human development, you'll see a greater shift towards social support type of conditionality, and during COVID, there's been more conditionality relating to COVID within the health sector, and there are and education-related conditionality has declined over time. In the financial sector, we see conditionality relating to banking institutions become more prominent. And then lastly, worth mentioning is that there's increasing conditionality in cross-sectoral issues relating to, for example, gender or the environment or climate change. So with that, let me pass it over to Stefan to talk about the performance of budget support and the future of budget support. Thank you.
Thank you, Moritz. So how well did budget support actually perform? We looked at all available independent evaluations and look at this in three different ways. First, by looking at the performance of budget support at the project level. Then secondly, asking about the success of budget support in affecting policy change at the country level. And then thirdly, we go back to what Shahrokh had presented at the beginning, which is the promise of budget support in addressing the Paris Declaration. So let me turn to each one of these questions in turn. Next slide. So at the project level, we find that budget support actually performs slightly better than traditional project financing, here called IPF, with about 75% of the operations reaching their development objectives as stated originally. And when we look at the success factors behind that, we can differentiate between the success factors on the donor side and those on the recipient side. On the donor side, we find factors that really contribute to success of operations include the analytic work, the design of the operation, the policy dialogue underpinning the preparation of the operation, and then finally, interestingly enough, also the experience of what in the World Bank we call the task team leader, so the team that actually prepares it. We really reiterate here the importance of analytic work and experience in supporting effective policy dialogue, and think that really contributes to stronger ownership and commitment for change. So that's, I think, an important finding. However, on the recipient side, we know less. So it's less conclusive here. We find that there's more success with high quality policies in institutions. As Moritz has said, however, over time, the bank has moved more into countries that actually have weaker institutions. So the picture is a bit blurred here. But we can see that even in low-income countries and fragile countries with low-quality institutions, budget support has also been used effectively in many cases. We also find that economic growth following the implementation of reform conditions is positively associated with program performance. So there are early wins in this program. To understand more, we probably need to dig into this deeper in the future, including, for instance, the role of political economy dynamics. So we were very much impressed by the publication of Gambling on Development by Stefan, who finds that a lot of the success of reforms really have to do with the ability of elites in country to reach a consensus, to move from one equilibrium that benefits them to another equilibrium that may have some adjustment costs. And that is, I think, probably one of the key elements to look at in the future. If you go to the next slide, please, we find that at the, go back. We find that at the country level, econometric evidence and the evaluation show that there's a positive impact, but its overall mixed budget support had positive impact on the quality of policies, particularly on economic policy reforms, public financial management, social protection, but less so in more complex reforms like civil service reforms, corruption, gender equality, and human capital. Perhaps because these are more complex, because they take more time, they're not stroke of the pen reforms. So here, the evidence was a little less convincing. As I mentioned, budget support can also be effective in fragile states and during economic crisis. And interestingly enough, we also find that repeated operations, budget support over many years, actually has decreasing returns, perhaps also because you then get into second generation reforms, and reforms get more institutional, more complex, more political. We also find that budget support has been successful in supporting the Paris Declaration principles. It has helped with financing predictability. It showed that the concerns over fiduciary risk were somewhat overblown. Although budget support does go through the country's public financial management systems, we did not find any extensive misappropriation. Although I will come to the episodes of corruption in countries that have then led to a certain disillusionment with budget support. The idea of country systems has always been central to budget support, and we do indeed find that the fact that budget support goes through countries' own budget systems is an important factor. But of course, this is an area where substantial strengthening is still needed, particularly in fragile countries. We also find that the results orientation that had been promised in the Paris Declaration was indeed supported by budget support, although here we see different experiences and clearly still some room for improvement to focus more on longer term outcomes that are then directly influenced by budget support and by policy reforms. If you go to the next slide, please, then we ask the question, so if budget support did so well overall, and actually better than project support, why is it that there was a disenchantment? Why is it that particular bilateral donors walked away from budget support and have now almost exclusively relied on traditional project financing? We find that part of the explanation is that there's a gap between the aspirations of greater aid effectiveness and the perceived reality of budget support that gave rise to a renewed scrutiny. And behind that were a number of factors, as unrealistic expectations of the actual inflows associated with budget support, but notably also, particularly in bilateral countries in Europe, a political shift towards more conservative governments that were skeptical of budget support and wanted to see more tangible projects that they could point to, where they could put their flag on, and that they could easily communicate to their parliaments back home. But we also saw the emergence of non-OECD DAC finance, as Shahrokh mentioned, the emergence of vertical funds that are not cross-cutting. We also saw in many countries an overloading of conditionality when many different donors, including multilaterals and bilaterals, cooperated in a way that was perceived as ganging up on recipient countries. In the original stages of budget support in low-income countries, there was also the so-called PRSP process, the idea that countries would develop their own poverty reduction strategies. While the idea was probably noble and good, in reality, it turned out that many of these reports were written by consultants or with strong help from the IMF and the World Bank, and really didn't have the type of ownership that was needed. We also finally find that since the early 2000s, there's been a shift in the development paradigm, perhaps less fond of big solutions, big transfers of funding, and more towards experimentation, iterative solutions, randomized trials, impact evaluations that have all moved the idea away from a Washington consensus that can then be financed and supported in developing countries, and instead focusing more on localized solutions that cannot easily be translated and transferred and scaled up. So if we go to the next slide, we then say, we discuss in detail what all this experience means for budget support in the future. And we find that we need to learn hard lessons that are needed to reshape the approach for budget support to retain the public support. And that includes a much more realistic projection of the financing, so not over-promising financing that will come from sources that are unclear, whether public or private. We need to understand much more how the political economy shapes the willingness of elites to engage in reforms. We also need to systematically address fiduciary concerns and refocus on public financial management as a core part of reforms to retain that credibility. And then finally, when we look at conditionality, we think it's important to have conditionality that's truly focused on important steps, what we call criticality, that are really relevant for longer term development outcomes and public goods, and also establish a much clearer division of labor amongst the different financiers of budget support. So in the last chapter of our book, we then take this forward and say, why do we think that budget support is still an important tool in the 21st century? And in a nutshell, we think that budget support is important because it helps address the growing global challenges, the financial crisis that have grown costlier, the existential threat of climate change and climate migration, the global pandemics. And we think that all of these challenges, the global challenges, require resources that are fast dispersing, shared technologies, and dialogue and policy change. And each one of these point to a growing need for and reliance on budget support. We think that budget support can be impactful in the right circumstances. And we developed sort of this notion that the type of conditionality has to change from what in the past was often could be characterized as conflictive conditionality to something that we could call credible concurrence between the financier and the recipient, agreeing on what are the key measures that can make a difference in bringing the country to a new equilibrium, to a new development path, and finding out how a policy dialogue and analytic work can underpin that and help move this forward. In all of this, I think we also need to build in learning, be adaptive, be much more agile, and allow for iterative approaches, because many of these reforms, of course, are political, they're difficult, they require internal dialogue in the countries. So what is much more important is the direction of travel, of where the country wants to go, and agreement on the overall outcomes that need to be achieved, and much less intrusiveness on the individual steps how to get there. And all of this points to the need for strong analytic underpinnings, credible macroeconomic framework, public finance reviews that look at the expenditure pattern, but also at the revenue pattern. They also need to include distribution analysis. And as I said repeatedly, it requires a very good understanding of the political economies where reforms are most pressing, to show that it's important to align the elite interests with the development priorities, which is not always very easy, as you know. So we find then, if you go to the next slide, that budget support is also an important tool for mobilizing additional resources from the private sector, because the need for greater resources requires a willingness to crowd in investment, which can only come from private resources rather than from public resources. It's important to have this financial firepower to preserve the counter-cyclical capacity of budget support to respond to crises that are growing in magnitude, in frequency, and in geographic spread. So financing must keep pace to help countries get out of the short-term inability to access financial markets. And in all of this, we need to strive to leverage private long-term investment flows. And we think that budget support can be a key tool in addressing this. If you can go to the next slide. We think that budget support is an ideal tool to bridge the gap between the traditional country-based model of multilateral development banks, and at the same time address the global challenges. Clearly, the country-based model is not sufficient to address the challenges that I mentioned, including migration, pandemics, and climate change. But it's important that the country-based model is complemented by financing that can also address these global public goods. And that's why we think that the multilateral development banks are best placed to advance the global public good agenda, including using budget support to support countries in addressing these global challenges, including through concessional financing where possible, all of which points to the need to shore up the capital base of multilateral development banks. And let me end here. So thank you very much for your patience, and we're happy to take any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you. Back to you, Shireen and Mary.
Thank you very much. And let's go straight to our lead commentators, and then we can follow with the questions accordingly. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marie Kawar, our former Minister of Planning in Jordan, and a very good friend of ERF and a policy affiliate, obviously. So, Dr. Marie, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. First and foremost, I would like to thank the authors and the organizers for sharing this important publication, for which I feel I updated my own knowledge on financing from the international experience. And also, as Dr. Shireen just said, it's so nice to reconnect with colleagues and friends and the ERF community. The book provides a comprehensive review of development aid. It is based on facts, and I agree with most of the analysis that resonates with my experience in Jordan. And I will be touching upon the particular experience of Jordan from the perspective of a practitioner, and also with a political economy framing. So the book is extremely timely, and for many reasons, some of which is that we are really 20 years since the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, and we are halfway through the SDGs. And so it's a moment to evaluate issues of ownership, harmonization of aid, alignment of national policy, and all the Paris Declaration principles. I think during those 2 decades, we have seen one crisis after the other. And now we have a new term emerging that we call it poly crisis. And this poly crisis specifically affects the Arab region, with so many difficulties and uncertainties having increased from the Arab Spring to the Syrian crisis, refugee crisis, regional conflicts. I mean, today we have countries like Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Syria, and of course the occupied Palestinian territories. So where does all this aid effectiveness fit? I feel we are facing new and unpleasant realities globally, regionally, and at the national level, including the war in Ukraine. Not to mention, including also energy, food, deglobalization, disruption of value chains, etc. Finally, we have also seen, and this affects the flows of aid, a move towards populism, both in donor and recipient countries. And unfortunately, this includes a tendency by some donor countries to directly subject development assistance to their foreign policy objectives. Not that this was not happening before, but I think it has intensified. And finally, most importantly, all this has resulted in a move away from multilateralism, which things like the Paris declarations or the SDGs are heavily anchored in. So basically, the book comes during our time of uncertain dynamics with a quickly shifting context, and summarizes how development financing can cope with. Now, just a small footnote, as we are speaking today, it is the 78th session of the UN General Assembly taking place in New York. And I say 78, so for 78 years, global leaders have been gathering to solve the problems that we are talking about. Anyway, put that aside. listening to the Secretary General's speech yesterday, I will quote, he said, "The global financial architecture is outdated, unjust, and dysfunctional. Power dynamics and constraints on global cooperation in today's world make problems more difficult to solve." So I don't know whether ERF has coordinated with the Secretary General of the United Nations on the timing of this seminar and our discussion. So let me move now to a few specific points of the book. I particularly liked the reference to global public goods. First, I agree that country allocations by multinational development banks on public goods should not compete against other allocations for financing critical development needs such as education, healthcare, core infrastructure, and similar needs. Second, allocations need to be based on a feasible action program, which is also a recurrent theme across the book. So the capacity and willingness of countries to make the best and realistic use of aid is critical, and the book pays due attention to the issue of implementation. One area that I would have liked to see more of is international experience regarding the role of public dialogue and social acceptance. Budget support is usually tied to conditionalities related to reforms, which usually face opposition from different groups at the national level. So as a practitioner, I kind of look for kind of international experience that that makes this process smoother. I mean, we know that most reforms fail due to social opposition to reform. So perhaps I missed reading about this in the report, and maybe it is for another research. Related to dialogue and social acceptability is the role of NGOs. They are mentioned in the book in terms of their future potential role in mobilizing finance for global public goods. And really, I cannot agree more. There is a large role for NGOs to play. However, it should be more than that. Some international NGOs and coalitions based in the global south are really vocal on aid effectiveness and are contributing to new thinking on development effectiveness. This needs to be more noted. This should be noted by mainstream UN agencies and Bretton Woods. And I realize that this may be outside the scope of this book, but to be thinking outside the box, we need to go beyond their roles in terms of just financing and think of them as more of thought partners, because there are a lot of good ideas out there and they emanate from the global south. So now, with these broader issues, I would like to share with you some aspect of my experience in Jordan, a country that has long been dependent on foreign aid and which has been affected by the changing architecture of aid in the last 2 decades, a period that the book addresses. Now, as a country, I think in the last decade last decade, we had a vision through national plans focusing on economic reform, water and energy, improvement in public services, and expansion of social protection. We also had the capacity through the level of education in general in the country and through the overall status of governance. But to move forward, the resources were not available. And especially as a middle income country, it was not ODA eligible. So for a while, there was foreign assistance. Jordan does have a lot of international friends. But in my view, it was short term. And exactly as the presentation of the colleagues Moritz, Shahrokh, and Stefan said, it was short term, heavy on conditionality, scattered in terms of focus, and uncoordinated in terms of the donors themselves. So the government could never take this long view of the reforms that are needed, and usually reforms take a long time. Now, by 2011, with the Arab Spring and the eruption of the Syrian refugee crisis, things started to unravel. Jordan was hosting 630 Syrian refugees, which costed the country, according to World Bank estimates, 2.5 billion a year. This is in addition to trade routes to the north that were closed, affecting regional trades and exports. Now, at the beginning of the crisis, humanitarian aid flowed in. While this was vital, it was not sufficient, especially as public services were stretched and the economic impact of the crisis was perceptible, especially on vulnerable Jordanians. And this is when the case of Jordan becomes interesting. So through government efforts and through the commitment of the international community, there was a shift in terms of development aid. There was scaling up in terms of quantity, and there was a long-term approach to aid, much of which was budget support in the form of grants and concessional loans, access to non-concessional loans, and there was very interesting donor private sector partnerships taking place. All this in parallel to the humanitarian assistance. So why is it so interesting? So first, Jordan, being a middle-income economy, had a specific situation where the international community responded to. Second, the political economy was at play. Countries of the West wanted to keep a stable Jordan, but they also wanted to keep the refugees in the neighborhood. So we will pay for the refugees to stay closer to their home in the hope that they will be going back. Third, there was a shift in aligning development work with humanitarian work. So Jordan's development and effective infrastructure and its social services were at the heart of the response crisis, and addressing both the needs and the needs of the refugees, but also the response was addressing the needs of the vulnerable Jordanians. And fourth is a shift towards country ownership, whereby budget support facilitated expansion of public services, expansion on infrastructure, both to refugees and Jordanians. So in conclusion, and for making the case for public support, budget support, I would like to say the following. Adaptation to country needs while keeping, of course, compliance with international standards, such as implementing SDGs. And this is what happened in Jordan as a non-ODA country. Budget support did lead to increased public spending, particularly in the social sectors of education, health, social protection. Of course, it is not possible to identify the effect of quality, but there has been expansion in provision. Budget support did have a positive effect on public sector financial management, as many of these grants included technical assistance in this area. Budget support also, I think, in my view, contributed to the macroeconomic stability in Jordan, which was going through a very critical moment. And my final point is the importance of donor coordination, which also Jordan benefited from. So there was commitment, a donor commitment to long-term approach, and there was a very interesting division of labor between the different donors. So for example, the Americans focused on health, the Germans focused on water and energy, etc. So this is what I have to say, and using the example of Jordan. Thank you again for an excellent and timely publication, which I am sure will come in useful, not just for me, for many other development practitioners as well.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Well, we can thank Dr. Shahrokh for the timing of this webinar today. He might have had a sense of what is coming. So to that, I give credit to Dr. Shahrokh, and I'm glad Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi is now able to join in the panel. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Rabah Ariski, who's the Director of Research of the French National Center for Scientific Research, and also a former Chief Economist of the African Development Bank and former Chief Economist of the World Bank Middle East and North Africa region. Dr. Rabah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shireen. I'll be brief. In the interest of fostering a discussion. So this is a wonderful book. You should all buy it. And so the book offers a powerful plea for budget support, albeit it is also offering qualification as to when budget support can work best. So I'm going to be focusing my discussion on these very caveat or nuances that the authors have talked about. On the face of it, obviously, budget support are providing a powerful incentive for leaders to make important reforms. But of course, that is hardly enough. And I must speak bluntly about the topic. So the stated goals are laudable, but there are important myths to debunk when it comes to budget support, and I'd like to take them in turn. So the first myth to debunk is the myth of benevolence of leaders and recipient countries. There's an interesting, there's a series of papers, and I think Stefan referred to some of them on aid effectiveness. And specifically, there was an important paper produced by the research department at the World Bank and a few co-authors that was recently published in the Journal of Political Economy, which is one of the leading journals in economics. And the paper does document a puzzling to say the least, evidence about aid, whether it's IPF or budget support, that these aid flows were followed by an increase in bank account in Switzerland. And of course, the paper is carefully executed, well done. It does concern low-income country. And indeed does offer some doubts, some challenges to that myth of benevolence. And of course, there is a flurry of paper around the timing of aid. Election time are prone to timing when donors do offer their generosity. One interesting example is the timing of the aid flow to Palestine in the context of an election where Hamas was gearing up to winning. This is documented in an American Economic Review paper where the timing of election does influence foreign aid. This speaks to the later paper, speaks to the issue of the myth of donors' benevolence as well. And when it comes to donor benevolence, the interesting part here is the incentive structure within these institutions. And there it is, I think, well recognized by those who spend time in this institution that volume is really at the heart of the incentive structure. Promotions, advancement in career really is very much looked at through the lens of this volume every fiscal year, and Stefan can hardly rebut that as a director of operation. The pressure deliver on volume is very strong. Obviously, there is a lot of talk about impact and quality, and there's a great effort in that area. But as we well know, volume have taken over, and that's how these institutions roll. So clearly, the political economy within this institution also does offer some pause when it comes to the incentive behind for staff to go ahead and push for these fast disbursing aid support. The last but not least myth of that needs to be debunked, and of course, the author do touch on this issue. I'm just trying to speak more bluntly about this issue, but I'm hoping this would be a subject for the conversation we will have now, is the myth of the trickle down of aid to the population. And there the debate has shifted toward giving aid directly, and there's enormous efforts in trying to just do that, and the World Bank and others at times have done that, have been innovative and delivered aid directly. And let me leave you with a provocative thought combining, I think, the very genuine, very strong intent behind budget support of fostering ownership. And so one proposal would be that to address this issue of benevolence of leader, one would propose that reforms would be undertaken, but that the aid would be given directly to the people. And there we would have we would basically end up with more benevolent leaders interested in the welfare of their population while still doing the important structural reform. I'll leave it here, and again, congratulations to the author for a wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabah. Before I give the floor to our panelists, our authors, to respond, I know we've been joined by Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim, would you be able to come in now, or would you rather come in after the response from our authors?
Thank you very much, Shireen. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Thank you very much.
We can hear you.
I think, I don't have access to the camera, and I am actually on the road from Casablanca to Rabat. So since I have good connectivity, I would rather make my two brief comments, or 3 comments, and then wait for the others to come. Let me first follow on to congratulate the authors, Dr. Shahrokh and his co-authors, for a very interesting. I didn't have, of course, the opportunity to read the book, but I read the PowerPoint. The layout of the PowerPoint is quite interesting, quite illuminating, and I think it covers all the bases, so to speak. And of course, the brain power of those behind, as well as the experience power behind the book, tells the whole story. I think we have a very interesting blend of perspectives and experiences, and of course the personalities involved are all leaders in this field. I wanted actually to in the topic of budget support performs equally well on that slide. There was, for me, puzzling. It might have been addressed, but I may have missed it. There is a statement on the recipient side factors I thought actually from the recipient side, in view of providing flexibility and ownership, and also results orientation, slightly puzzled by this statement as to why there is little is known, given the, the history, the relatively rich history of budget support. The other question pertains to the statement that they are decreasing returns to budget support as reforms get more complex. It's not clear to me why there will be decreasing returns to budget support as reforms get more complex. Because again, as reforms get more complex, I would imagine that budget support should be better suited than programmatic or certainly, project support, because it allows opportunities for the stakeholders to widely debate and come up with some sort of a consensus or broad consensus about what needs to be done, such as, for example, the issues of transiting from commodity subsidies to broad social protection. I think this is very complex. It involves considerable political economy, considerations, and I thought that budget support would provide an opportunity and flexibility to the government in its dialogue with civil society and political institutions. Finally, I want actually to conclude with a comment along the same lines of Mary, Dr. Mary. As a Minister of Finance in Sudan for a short stint of one year, but very impactful 1 year, we tried to do so many things, including rehabilitating Sudan after a long, devastating kleptocratic regime that really destroyed the economy of Sudan and impacted negatively so many things, including the social cohesion and peace. And so one of the agenda that we tried to address was to peace building, with rebel movements in various parts of the country. And I remember a very important point in the discussion was, okay, we have reached an agreement. This is what the rebel leaders were saying. But how are we going to finance, or are you as a government going to finance the programs for peace building, rehabilitating the ravaged economy in the areas affected by conflicts, resettlement of the displaced and refugees, and so on, especially from the region of Darfur, which is a vast, populous region. And we told them that, as a Minister of Finance, I told them that we will be enhancing our cooperation with bilateral and multilateral donors, and we will positively target conflict-affected regions and so on. And we are also going to enhance our fiscal effort, and resource mobilization. And that didn't really ring a bell to them. It wasn't seen very convincing. So in another round of meeting, I talked to Hafiz Ghanim, then the Vice President for the Africa region, about that we need something. And I mentioned to him the budget support. So he sent me a conditional letter, but quite a good letter, saying that Sudan, with a 45 million size of population, will be eligible for, about $1 billion between 1 billion and 1.5 billion in budget support as part of the IDA program. And I shared this letter with them, and that has been pretty effective in assuring them that actually the government will have resources that are not tied to specific projects or specific interest of donors, and that given the commitment of the central government to prioritize peace building, they seem to be quite convinced once we share this information with them. So I think that is another dimension that relates to the increasing support through budget support to fragile and conflict-affected countries. And unfortunately, of course, for us in Sudan, that we experienced a post-transition relapse, and of course, you know, we are not in a position to rehabilitate the country so far, or to get budget or any kind of support, given the situation now in Sudan. So this is just my thought that I wanted to share with you by way of reinforcing the point about the importance of budget support for fragile and conflict-affected countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. I'll give the floor to Dr. Shahrokh to see how you'd like to orchestrate that last bit in terms of your response, Dr. Moritz and Dr. Stefan's response to Dr. Mary's, Dr. Rabah's, and Dr. Ibrahim's comments, and also to the issue that was raised in the Q&A. Floor is yours, Dr. Shahrokh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shireen. I'm very grateful for the excellent comments by our discussants and also by Dr. Ibrahim as well. I say a couple of things myself, and then I will go to my colleagues for their thoughts. I think the questions that have been raised, they're all extremely important. I think there is no a consensus. I think I'm trying to address this issue that was raised by Dr. Mary in the context of Jordan, and also by Dr. Ibrahim in the context of Sudan, that there is now a consensus in the donor community that there is a nexus of development, humanitarian aid, and conflict. And that around this nexus, a framework that has to be agreed upon to make sure that the donors work together with the recipients with a framework that takes into account each of these elements, because each of them require a different type of intervention, but they need to be consistent with each other in order to support not only development, but also diffuse possibility of conflict and so forth. So, and budget support it plays a very important role, given its flexibility and given the very dire need for financial assistance early on in the process of dealing with the humanitarian crisis, as well as development issues and the humanitarian issues. And Middle East and North Africa region, I think I would also include Sudan, is basically in dire need of such a strategy going forward, given the fact that requirements for making progress on sustainable development goals, which was estimated by UN to have been short of about $2.5 trillion for developing countries as a whole. And that gap has now increased to 4 trillion as a result of COVID, inflation, and other setbacks, that the fact that they didn't really make much progress over the past few years. And the Secretary General of the UN just his report to the General Assembly last week indicated that extreme poverty not only will not be eliminated by 2030, but based on the current estimates, we could end up with very substantial amount of poverty by 2030, extreme poverty in developing countries. So that requires a very significant financial assistance to developing countries, particularly those that are now not only affected by these crises, but also have a very high burden of debt, external debt to deal with, which makes their financial management even more difficult. On the issue of governance, and I think the points that were mentioned by Dr. Rabah, I think those are very important, and I leave it to my colleagues Stefan and Moritz, who have worked on those areas to address the issue. On the one final comment on the finding that in longer term, over the longer term engagements, there is a decreasing returns to budget support. I think that is a quantitative finding. It's an econometric finding, but it is, if you take a look at case studies, that's not the case in all, all the developing countries. For example, Vietnam is one country that the bank had a very, World Bank had, and other donors had a longer term engagement, which they, the impact of these supports remained significant and positive going forward. I think what makes the quantitative findings kind of fragile in a sense, and one has to really look at the case studies to come to a judgment, is that over the long term, countries go through different governments, and different governments have different priorities and different views. And so not always the same set of reforms are followed. And also countries are subject to different types of crises over a longer term. So one needs to take all of these things into account, but which we hope to address this in a maybe a blog or something in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahrokh. Maybe I can take it from here. First, I have to really thank our panelists. I'm very impressed to have such a formidable panel of policymakers and commentators who've actually been in the institutions themselves. So you were extremely well placed to talk about this, and I'm very impressed by how you contributed your own experiences here. And so I can't actually disagree with anything you've said. All the points that you raised are very valid and very good. I'd maybe like to just pick up a few of them. Dr. Mari, you talked about the need for a longer term engagement and donor coordination. Fully agree with you on all of that. Part of the issue I think we see is the both, and this speaks to Rabah's point, both within the governments, but also perhaps in the donor institutions, including the multilateral development banks, we all have a short-term focus and many of these reforms really require a very long-term patient engagement. And the way we're set up, both in the institutions, including the World Bank and in the governments, doesn't lend itself to that. We are focused much more on short-term results, and as a result, perhaps focus too much on immediate steps that may themselves not be significant enough. So that's why we have this plea for focus on longer-term results that the country itself can subscribe to, hopefully over successive governments, and that the donor institutions, including the World Bank, multilateral development banks, can then also support over the long term. But we also recognize that many of these reforms are very, very difficult. So I worked, for instance, in Indonesia, where one of the key issues that policymakers recognized for a long time is the need to reduce fuel subsidies. We knew through various studies, and policymakers recognized that they were regressive, that they benefited the better off in the country, that they diverted resources from other pressing needs. But yet it was incredibly difficult for policymakers to abolish them and reduce the fuel subsidies. And successive operations, and I think this partially explains the question by Dr. Ibrahim, successive operations targeted this, but failed to push policymakers to really then implement it until it was done relatively recently, so after about 2 decades of discussions. And so I think the one area we have to focus on in the future is to have a much better understanding of when the time is ripe for these discussions for when aid on additional financial flows can really be helpful in pushing policymakers to make that final courageous step that is often painful and often associated with a pushback from within the country. And I think, again, Stefan Durkan's book on gambling on development, I found very insightful because it goes through a number of these cases and essentially says that often this is a bit of a gamble. You cannot predict it. This is not engineering. This is a very complex discussion where particularly elites in a country have to reach a consensus to get out of their often comfortable equilibrium where they're benefiting from some of these distortions to move to another equilibrium where some of them may actually lose out. And this is at the core of what many of these reforms are about. So it's Rabbi, you're right. It's not so much questioning the benevolence of policymakers because we have some of the policymakers here, and clearly they were very well intended, but they faced opposition, and they faced the difficulty of that. So I think we need to have a better understanding of what makes a country move from one equilibrium to another and on a different growth path and a different development path, and how can this domestic process of consensus finding be supported by outside actors, including, as Mari said, international NGOs. We would not be where we are today in many of the countries, including in MENA, on gender issues, on climate issues, if it hadn't been for this outside discussion, which contributed to the internal discussion. Left to their own devices, many of the countries would not have moved in a more progressive way. Of course, it's clear that international institutions, international NGOs can never substitute for this domestic debate, domestic policy making, the domestic consensus finding, but they can contribute to it, including through research findings, also pressure and international comparisons. And I think this is where it's not only about financing, it's also about being part of that debate in a country and helping shape that consensus making that then can move forward with reforms. I think that's part of the answer. On the longer term reforms that Dr. Ibrahim questioned, I think part of the answer is, as Shahrokh said, is the findings we have, but part of the explanation has to do with the type of reforms that are being supported. The longer term reforms, such as civil service reform, for instance, tend to be not as successful as the shorter term reforms, such as trade reforms, which can be done with one legislation, because they require a change in culture, change in attitude, a profound change in the economic model. If you think of how many people are employed, for instance, in the public sector in the MENA regions, and how strong the role of the state is, it requires a generational shift. Rabah, as you know, you've worked on this, and I have many of your publications here on my shelf that talk about the importance of the private sector in providing the source of growth, providing opportunities for young people to enter the job market. And I think this big policy debate, particularly in the MENA countries, is something where international donors can help, but they cannot substitute for this consensus that needs to emerge within the countries themselves. Let me maybe end it there.
Thanks, Stefan. If I can just come in briefly on that last point of the long-term impact. I think it can be helpful to differentiate between the reform agenda that is being supported on the one hand, and on the other, the financing. So yes, it may be right that there are low-hanging fruits and first-generation reforms that are easier to address than more complicated second and third-generation reforms. But there is also the predictability and the stability of financing that's involved, right? And that on its own is very valuable. And the EU, for example, has this has a somewhat different engagement modality, right, where they have the fixed tranche system where they ensure this this predictability and stability of financing support on the one hand, as well as a performance tranche where they pay against the achievement of or progress against some of the reforms. And so then if we look at the long-term impact, right, then there will be a difference across those two spectrums, and I think it's important to also consider the role that the predictability and stability of financing has for recipient countries. Thanks.
Dr. Shahrokh, we've got one hand raised by Dr. Zohair Hajou. If we have an opportunity for him to address the question.
Sure.
Dr. Zohair? Hello?
I think he's on mute.
Dr. Zohair, are you online? Can you hear us? If you can you can speak, but please unmute. Seems that he's not on. So, okay, back to you, Dr. Shahrokh.
I think this is we are almost at the end of our time. So it's a very helpful questions, I think very constructive set of questions that have been raised. And I think the issues that were raised, I think regarding the governance factors and potential corruption role for corrupt officials to siphon off funds, I don't think that would be different for project lending or budget support. I think because as you know, budget support is only 20% of the total lending by MDBs and bilaterals. 80% is project support, and the significance of budget support really happens during the crisis. And during the crisis, the governments around the world, especially in the poorer countries, there is a dire need to be able to finance their budget, in order to keep the schools open, the clinics open, to be able to basically function. And I think it would be, I think, highly unusual if there are cases where during the crisis time when the budget support increases, there is a significant amount of siphoning off of these funds. And if there are, I'm sure there will be a reaction by the donor community of this. Given that these the findings that was mentioned in the publication may be based on historical data and going back a couple of decades, I'm sure there were many cases in the past. But as we have tried to show in our book, budget support has gone under substantial reforms and much more transparent than it was before. And of course, that doesn't eliminate the possibility, but hopefully incidence of corruption has declined over the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahrokh. And I think with that, a special word of thanks to each and every one of our panelists. It's been very rich discussion. All the material, including the ones that are going to be cleared by the speakers, the presentation material are going to be on the event page. So if you wish to go back to it or actually share it broader with your community, it's going to be there available for your access. A warm thank you and a very good evening to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Dr.
much for
Shirin.
hosting us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you
Take
to the
care.
Thank
panelists.
you.